My name is Catherine Lofton, and I teach U.S. religious history in the Department of Religious Studies, American Studies History, and Divinity here. And I'm going to lead off just by introducing our first speaker, who is George Kohler. And George's paper is pertaining to the panel theme, which is 19th century philosophy and theology. Again, we have two speakers. Each will speak for about 25 minutes. And then, unfortunately, Paul Franks can't be here to moderate. I'm going to do a wholly inadequate job relative to his great talents. And more importantly, Joshua Burns, directly to my left, is going to offer some really amplified thinking on the subject. So he's really going to take the weight of the thinking on this point. So just to begin, George Y. Kohler, who is born in 1966 in East Germany, immigrated to Israel in 1998. He got his MA in medieval Jewish philosophy in 2006. And in 2010, his PhD from the Ben-Gurion University of Negev. He had a postdoctoral fellowship at the Goethe University in Frankfurt in 2011. And since 2012, he's been a senior lecturer at the Department for Jewish Thought at Bar-Ilan University in Ramat Gan. He has published in 2012 Reading Maimonides' Philosophy in 19th Century Germany. And in 2013, he published Jewish Messianism in the Age of Emancipation, Reinterpretations between Davidic Kingship and Eschatological Socialism. His research interests range from modern Jewish philosophy, 19th century theology, Jewish-Christian relations, and theological antisemitism. Today he will be speaking to us on the following subjects: supersessionism and Jewish-Christian debates in Germany between 1830 and 1870. George.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. What I refer to as supersessionism is what you just called replacement theory theology. This is the same thing. It's called substitution theory, replacement, whatever, but this is the same, actually the same idea. And I'm not talking about all the Jewish-Christian debates in this period, but only of one, and this, I think it's the most famous one. It's the debate around a pamphlet of the German philosopher Bruno Bauer, Die Judenfrage, published in 1842. This debate became famous not because of our subject today, but because Karl Marx, wrote his famous anti-Semitic, maybe, pamphlet against Bauer as a review of Bauer's writings. And this is how the Bruno Bauer debate became famous. I don't want to focus on this issue, not on the political side of it, but on the theological side of it. So most of the reactions to Bauer were political, were about the question why Bauer is against granting the Jews emancipation. But his arguments, the arguments he used in making this point, the arguments are rather theological. And what is generally overlooked in research literature is that there is a long list of Jewish respondents to Bruno Bauer, who of course argue on the theological level against this modern version, secularized version of supersession theory that Bauer is presenting. And this is the nice thing about the 19th century, what this panel is about, that we have for the first time until now, we have heard all the bad things that Gentiles, or the author of John, whoever that was, say about Jews. And now we hear, I'm trying to present what Jews have to answer, and not in a polemical way, not from my point of view, not from a Jewish point of view, but in a very philosophical, theological way. This is probably the first time the Jews argue back on these questions, and this is what I like about 19th century. So I will, in the first part of my paper, present a short summary of what Bauer has written in his famous pamphlet, Die Judenfrage, from 1842, and in the second part I will refer to three Jewish reactions to Bauer. So, as I said, the rabbis responding to Bauer cannot ignore the theological arguments that Bauer actually mentions in his work. Interesting is that what Bauer presents on the field of religion is to a great extent Hegelian, that is a secularized version of this old Christian theology of supersessionism. That again is the theory that Christianity not only replaced Judaism historically, but also substituted all that was once a Jewish contribution to religious progress and culture with its own values, and thus made Judaism obsolete, futile, expendable, whatever you want to call it. So now what is interesting about the Jewish reactions is that the Jewish respondents, the rabbis that reacted to Bauer, most of them were Hegelian thinkers themselves. So they meet on this common ground, in fact. And that makes their apparently self-evident rejection of Christian supersessionism even more interesting. The Jewish theologians are forced by Bauer to provide counter-arguments for a justification of Jewish existence in history, that is, to prove what contributions Judaism made and is still able to make to world civilization and culture, independent of Christianity. So, this is the challenge, in fact. And this is probably, as I said, the first time the Jewish voices formulate serious theories about place and meaning of Judaism within the development of universal religious thought, and thus something like a starting point at all for modern Jewish philosophy. So, Bauer's argument is surprisingly sophisticated and challenging for an outright anti-Semitic pamphlet. It operates with the classical supersessionism of the church, but in a very modernized and highly intellectualized version of Hegel's philosophy of historical development. Bauer was, at the time of his writing, still a left Hegelian with strong atheist tendencies. He had been deprived of his authorization to teach theology at Prussian universities earlier the same year this pamphlet was published, both for his naturalist readings of the gospel, of all the Gospels, and for his atheist, rationalistic way of teaching Protestant priests. Having broken with Marx and communism already the year earlier in 1941, Bauer remained for the time from the writing of the pamphlet until the end of his life rather an arch-Hegelian critic of Christianity as well as of Judaism, whose influence on Christian theology he radically tried to diminish throughout his life. In Hegelian garb, the old Christian substitution theory assumed a new, much more drastic form, while for St. Augustine, there was still a rational explanation, even if it's not a very flattering one, for the further existence of the Jews. Under Hegelian dialectics, the older parts of the historical contradiction were completely dissolved in history with the victorious emergence of the synthesis. Applied by Bauer to religion, it was Christianity who contradicted Judaism and thus robbed it of its right to exist, while in the end both religions, Judaism and Christianity, were superseded by the philosophical principle of an almost atheistic pantheism in Bauer. Bauer demonstrated this for several theological notions, and I don't want to go into that. For some strange reason, Bauer expressed his supersessionist model still in the old metaphor of mother and daughter religion that you might probably know, Christianity and Judaism. It is not the daughter who is unappreciative of the mother, claims Bauer, but the mother refused to acknowledge her daughter. After the daughter has understood and further advanced the legacy of the mother, both cannot exist next to each other anymore. This is how Bauer concluded in his Hegelian way and sublated, in the atheist synthesis, both religions. So what Bauer in fact accuses Jewish theology of is that it does not follow Hegel. Judaism insisted on an ahistorical authority of its law and thus on the meta-historical existence of itself as a people. The reason for the stubborn Jewish incapacity for historical development was thus easily identified in the heteronomous source of the law itself, which is traced by Bauer to its Oriental origin. The old Israelite, he says, has not yet acquired the consciousness that he is a free agent and a rational being, and therefore he still regards the observance of meaningless ceremonies as his noble task. Heteronomy is important both for Spinoza, as you probably know, and also for Hegel in their explanation of Judaism as outdated. The Jews neither live their own lives nor accomplish their own actions by definition. The Jew is never motivated by his own will. This is the purpose of the legend of the divinity of the law in the Jewish view. In this view, the law assumes an eternal ahistorical truth value for Bauer, as it was for Hegel before him. Truth have a relative value only. They appear and disappear in the course of history, making way for the ultimate truth, which is the truth of perpetual criticism of source, of course, or truths arrived at through criticism in Hegel and in Bauer. in my view, this is a really good opportunity to realize why modern Jewish thought was always more drawn to Kantian philosophy than to Hegelian philosophy. One point, Bauer admits that he fails completely to understand the internal logic of a very central demand of Jewish theology, that is the imitatio Dei, the imitation of God, expressed in the famous verse that you all know from Leviticus, Kedoshim tiyu ki ani kadosh, be holy because I am holy. For Bauer, the consequence does not follow from the premise here in this verse at all. For Judaism, however, this is me talking now, the transcendent, immaterial God represents exactly this eternal but ultimately indiscernible truth value. Imitation of God thus means rather an infinite search for God. This is the challenge that Bauer's Jewish opponents have to cope with in their attempts to reject his philosophical antisemitism. After all, the debate took place in 1943, year after the publication of the pamphlet of Bauer, so this is long before Kantian philosophy was reintroduced into German Kathederphilosophie at German universities, which happens only in the second half of the 19th century. So this is, in short, a summary of the Bauer pamphlet. The first Jewish thinker who replied in detail to Bauer's attacks on Judaism was clearly a Hegelian philosopher himself, and therefore tried to beat Bauer on his own game. Samuel Hirsch, maybe you've heard of him, was at the time of his writing against Bauer the rabbi of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, published in 1848 his major work, a 500 pages path-breaking philosophical analysis, in my view, of Judaism from a largely Hegelian viewpoint. A work that to this day, I guess, is really underestimated. It's the beginning of Jewish analysis of New Testament in a very professional way, interestingly. In 1943, Hirsch wrote a book-length refusal of Bauer, reiterating many of his basic assessments concerning the history and the tenets of Jewish thought. For Hirsch, Judaism is founded on general ethical principle. He's a Reform rabbi, except for being a philosopher. He's a Reform rabbi. It's not founded on law, but on general ethical principles. And those principles that he calls the pillars of purest morality are at the same time of eternal value and part of a historical development. It is exactly their ahistorical, unchangeable, a priori truth that turned those basic teachings of Judaism into what Hirsch calls the only driving force of all history to date. So when Hirsch thus implicitly demonstrated the importance of Judaism for historical progress, he refuted at the same time the claim of heteronomy of Jewish law. Hirsch says, it was exactly Paul's mistake, not Judaism's. It was Paul's mistake to translate the word Torah with nomos, with law. Okay, this has nothing to do with Judaism in Hirsch's view. And interestingly, this is an argument that he introduced first in 1943, and you find this in every subsequent Jewish theologian until the 20th century. They all say it all began with the wrong translation of Torah, which in the original Hebrew, as you might all know, means teaching, Lehre in German in Hirsch's word, and not law, and not something static. And seen as an ongoing process of learning and thus adapting reality, Torah is no longer the expression of an arbitrary divine will in Judaism that is foreign to man. Rather, the true understanding of the will of God is that man lives according to what is essential to humanity. Therefore, Hirsch concluded the Jew who carries out God's will in fact carries out only his own genuine will. End of quote. The internal logic of the human imitation of God is to be found in man's likeness to God, according to the Bible, to a God who presents the very essence of humanity. Bauer's view of holiness, which made him reject the notion of imitatio Dei, is, as inconsistent in his words, is simply the contrived holiness of Christianity, a monkish holiness, as Hirsch writes, which is directly opposed to the Jewish idea of holiness that must be realized in the midst of true life here below. Hirsch then developed a very sophisticated, highly interesting counter-history to Bauer's supersessionist views on Judaism that I can outline only very briefly here. The coming of Christ, this is the shared opinion of Bauer and the church's substitution theology, had a double meaning. On the one hand, it demonstrated that to the Jews their own futility, the futility of their idea that to fulfill God's law, fulfill God's will by keeping what they believed was God's law. Okay. On the other hand, Christ shows the way out of this dilemma. Salvation comes through faith alone because nature is inherently sinful. All this is wrong. Judaism protests Hirsch, believes in the purity of nature, that man is guiltless of illness and death, and is not in need. Where's Ruth? Is absolutely, here you have you Jews saying this. Judaism is not in need of a redeemer. The consequence of this irreconcilable contradiction between the two religions is that Bauer, as a Hegelian philosopher, must deny, as he really does, that Jesus has ever existed. Modern Jewish theology, on the other hand, Hirsch continues, accepts the historical Jesus, not the miracle maker, of course, but the historical Jesus, as a true consequence of Judaism, as a Jewish gift to the world. For Hirsch, Jewish, and I quote, is the classical expression of monotheism and therefore the classical expression of mankind, end of quote. While Jews were anything but detached from the cultural progress of humanity in the time that followed Jesus, as Bauer had claimed famously, Hirsch admitted that they still could not build a godly, gottgefällig in German world on earth, as he said, because they were just lacking the political power to do so. Therefore, they often retreated to Talmud study as the only dignified intellectual activity left for them during the dark times of the Middle Ages. On the Christian side, only Martin Luther revitalized the true spirit of Christ, according to Hirsch, which grew right out of Jewish sources, when Luther thought it is the mundane, das Weltliche, in German, that canon should be holy. This modern idea led to the establishment of the Christian state, which is considered by Hirsch, in the wake of Hegel, obviously to be the greatest establishment, the greatest accomplishment of Protestantism. Other than Hegel, however, Hirsch believed the modern Christian state represents exactly this ancient Jewish notion of the sanctification of this worldly life that the Christian Reformation has rediscovered. A state of this nature, the political expression of holiness, can and must grant the Jews emancipation as observant Jews. It was Judaism which made the state possible because for millennia Jews have given their heart's blood, in Hirsch's words, for the religious idea behind it. The Jews knew it was their eternal mission to become, I quote, the blessing of the world, and this is why they had survived until, or they will survive also in the future until their mission is accomplished and the Messiah will finally come, as Hirsch concludes his words. Now, Hirsch's daring reply to Bruno Bauer was widely read and discussed in contemporary German Jewry. All of the major Jewish journals, academic and popular, published detailed reviews of Hirsch's brochure. Especially interesting is a critical discussion of Hirsch's view that I want to mention shortly, written by the young Hermann Jelinek for a journal called Literaturblatt des Orients in 1843. Hermann Jelinek is the brother of Adolf Jelinek, the first Kabbalah scholar of 19th century Wissenschaft des Judentums movement. Hermann is the younger brother, was executed at the age of 26 in Vienna for his participation in the revolution, but managed to write something on our subject before that happened, a few years before. Jelinek's review is at the same time a devastating criticism of Bauer's pamphlet itself and a praise of Hirsch's response. While Bauer's view of Christianity is ultimately nothing but the old orthodox supersessionism in modern philosophical language, Hirsch, says Jelinek, was a true pioneer in a scientific explanation of the Jewish core of the Gospels. But Jelinek is also critical of what he considered to be Hirsch's tolerant position towards Pauline Christianity. Jelinek joined here a view, and this is really interesting, that was held by a whole group of influential German Jewish theologians in the 19th century, and the leader of this group is Abraham Geiger, that you probably know, all of you. And this view might be read as the most radical response that Jews had for Christian supersessionism. It says, basically, Christianity itself has contributed nothing valuable to the development of Jewish culture. This is what Geiger thought, and that was the young Jelinek thought, actually, and wrote, and publicly said throughout the 19th century. In indirect inversion of the common anti-Semitic accusation to this end, that Judaism has nothing or had nothing contributed to civilization, it was argued that not only on the field of religion, but also concerning natural sciences and even art, everything revolutionary. Every revolutionary development was ever directed against the Christian position, which stalled progress and burned its advocate. There was no Jewish art for Jelinek, for example. The greatness of Raphael's Madonna is because it is a beautiful woman and not as a Christian icon. So this is an interesting position in our field of 19th century research, because usually we read the opposite, that Jewish, especially Jewish reform movement is imitating Protestantism. So here you have the reform leaders saying there's nothing to imitate, they have not contributed anything to civilization. Still in the same year, 1948, another prominent Jewish theologian published a detailed refutation of Bauer's position towards Judaism. This is the leader of the old Hamburg Reform Temple, Gotthold Salomon, at the time one of the most senior and most famous pulpit rabbis in Germany. Although he agreed in most aspects with the arguments provided by Hirsch a few months earlier, Salomon wrote in the preface to his book Against Bauer, Hirsch had presented his arguments in a confused and, on the other hand, intellectual, ambitious way, so that Salomon, saw the urgent need to restate the Jewish reply to Bauer's attack in a more popular form and for a wider circle of readers. But while most of Hirsch's argument indeed reappear in Salomon's text, there are a few ideas where Salomon went beyond Hirsch, and I want to refer to them. In general, where Hirsch argued with Hegel, Salomon argued with the Bible. And even the Talmud is for Salomon a clear example of the ethical progress of Judaism after and independent of Jesus. The purpose of the Talmud was to humanize Mosaic law. Kind of a bold claim that Salomon makes here. And Salomon tried to prove with several examples from the Talmud that this is, in fact, Reform Judaism that we find with the Talmudic sages. The Talmud, this is repeated several times through Solomon's book, was the attempt to counteract the dead letter of the Mosaic law, so that the letter will not rule and exercise his despotic power over the consciousness. This way, I think Solomon not only replied to the supersessionist claim that Judaism lacked any sign of progress after the rise of Christianity, also the accusation of the meaninglessness of Talmudic ritual was warded off, if only by recruiting the Talmudic sages for Reform Judaism, of course. After that, in great detail, Solomon listed the achievements of Jewish thought for human civilization throughout the centuries, beginning with Philo, mentioning, of course, Maimonides, medieval philosophers, commenters, poets, and finally arriving at Mendelssohn, whom he called the modern Socrates. But while those Jewish contributions are indisputable, Solomon even defends Christianity against Bauer. Returning to the metaphor of mother and daughter, Solomon tried to explain the relation of the generations in a more natural way than Bauer did before him, even, and this is what he says, even if the daughter is more attractive than the mother, and even if she had 1 million more admirers, everything she is came from her mother. Judaism, Solomon argued against Bauer's supersessionism, can peacefully coexist with all its daughters and all other religions. Her Christian daughter, it is true, is not of such mild disposition. She is driven by a conquering temper. But nothing of this can explain the exclusiveness, in fact, of the Jew hatred that Bauer had contributed to Christianity. Antisemitism, in Salomon's view, is always the product of intentional, straightforward incitement and not of religious claims to the absoluteness of one's own truth. Jew hatred must be implanted, grafted onto Christianity. It did not grow naturally out of mere theological reasons. Whether it would, and I quote here, whether it was taught and preached by inhuman priests or lay people, by the throne or by the mob, anti-Semitism always has rather the most despicable and base motives, Solomon claimed, end of quote, and Christian substitution theology was only the fig leaf of those claims, in his view. The anti-Semite abuse of Christianity, as he calls it, was still in full bloom today, now taken over by men who hold university chairs in philosophy and history, and we hear about this soon. Contrary to the traditional Christian model of substitution, Solomon now developed his own model of religious tolerance. Interestingly, though, it is first and foremost Christianity that has to change before tolerance could come into effect. Christianity must rid itself of the intentionally implanted Jew hatred it has. If Christianity is able to emancipate the Jews, it will itself be emancipated, says Solomon. But as long, and I quote again, as long as it wants to rule, it will serve. And as long as it seeks salvation in domination, it finds itself in slavery, end of quote. Once both religions walk hand in hand, Solomon wrote in the long summary of his book, it will become apparent that not Bauer's pessimistic atheism, but religious optimism is the very foundation of peace and freedom. Not religion itself is the problem behind hatred and war in this world. Bauer's Hegelian sublation of religion would mean to heal the headache by beheading. Sorry for the comparison, but this is what he said. And I prepared this paper before this became something like... So the future will bring much more than a dead peace. That is Solomon's conclusion. It will bring the living freedom of religious cooperation between Judaism and Christianity, with neither side having to claim superiority. In summary, when Jewish thinkers reacted to Bruno Bauer's secular version of supersessionism, they argued in a variety of ways, as we saw. What all their rejections of Bauer have in common, however, is the notion of a unique mission of Judaism to humanity that is still not fulfilled and cannot be fulfilled by Christianity, at least not in Christianity's current state. This mission would thus justify the existence of Judaism both in the past and in the future. Mosaic monotheism had not only, I quote, given all civilized nations and states a moral foundation, end of quote, Gotthard Salomon, monotheistic Jewish religious doctrine was also the ideal guidance for a peaceful and unified humanity in the future. Whether some Jewish disputants claimed the absolute superiority of Judaism over half-pagan Christianities, others rather emphasized the influential Christian contribution to the universal propagation of Jewish ideas, still others called on Christianity to become aware of its Jewish essence and live up to it. None of all the people involved in the discussion would agree with Bauer that Judaism is an outlived concept of religion, stubbornly kept alive by some irrational illusionists who refuse to accept the exclusive rights of the daughter religion. Whether they saw in Bauer's attack a new moral danger coming from philosophical atheism or rather the old language of Christian supersessionism, the debate with Bruno Bauer gave the Jewish theologians a welcome opportunity to reason out and locate, and this is probably again for the first time in Jewish intellectual history, Judaism's precise place within the intellectual developments of world history. Forced by Bauer to justify Judaism's very own role in the modern world, instead of criticizing Christian irrationalism, Bauer's Jewish opponents began to analyze Jewish religion and history from the outside of it, from a philosophical point of view. And in this sense, I think this debate is still of value today. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Next, Anders Gurmar will be speaking. Dr. Anders Gurmar is the president of the Scandinavian School of Theology and the associate professor of New Testament exegesis at Uppsala University. In his doctoral dissertation from 2001, he challenged the use of the Judaism-Hellenism dichotomy in New Testament exegesis. And since then, his research has focused on anti-Jewish thought and in academic German exegetical contexts from 1750 to 1950. The latter research resulted in his book, Roots of Theological Anti-Semitism, published by Brill in 2009. He is presently working on a study of anti-Jewish thought structures from early church fathers to the Holocaust. And today he will be speaking to us on the construction of the Jews in 19th-century German Protestantism, the case of Tübingen professors Beck and Bauer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I will talk not about Bruno Bauer, but about F.C. Bauer. So just to make it clear. The construction of the Jews in 19th century German Protestantism, the case of Tübingen professors Beck and F.C. Bauer. During my studies, I happened to do some work on the Tübingen New Testament professor Gerhard Kittel and his, at least in his earlier years, associate Walter Grundmann, due to the fact that they were not only exegetes, but National Socialist exegetes. After my doctoral dissertation, this led to my study, Roots of Theological Antisemitism, focusing on German Protestant exegesis from 1750 to 1950. And if anyone wants to look at it afterwards, I have it here. Just as we are, these theologians were part of a history. And here I focus on two scholars, also in Tübingen, where in the early and mid-1800s, both Ferdinand Christian Bauer, 1792 to 1860, and Johann Tobias Beck, 1804 to 1878, were professors of theology. Bauer was a church historian, but with a tremendous scope from New Testament to church history and systematic theology and more. Beck was a professor of theology. Much separated Beck and Bauer, and at first sight, the fact that Bauer favored Beck seems peculiar, since they belong to the two opposing streams which still prevail in German theology. Beck's theological profile was opposite of Bauer's, Beck being the leading biblicist, having, for example, spent many years of fighting, for example, De Wette's views. Beck's background was in Old Württemberg Pietism, but his theology wasn't fully kosher in the Lutheran environment due to his non-forensic view of justification. However, he was one of the most cherished preachers of his time and was both the key figure in the Tübingen faculty and the head preacher, Frühprediger, in the Stiftskirche in Tübingen. Bauer must be regarded one of the founding fathers of modern exegesis, even though his picture of Jews and Judaism has much in common with, for example, Semmler and Schleiermacher. But with Bauer, a dialectical description of early Christianity really got a breakthrough in New Testament studies, as part of his study of early church history formed in the vein of Hegel and Schelling. So we are on the same ground in several ways here. Christian history was part of world history to Bauer. The two worlds of paganism and Judaism on the verge of dissolution are becoming a synthesis in Christianity. To Bauer, this movement is also parallel to a similar political one, which ends up in the Roman Empire. A key part of his analysis is that both describe a trajectory from particularism to universalism. To Bauer, Jews and Judaism is the example of particularism. Jewish national character is peculiar, and the Jews always maintained this quote-unquote obstinate dissimilarity from other peoples. As the Jews lived in Palestine, They were locked into a world of nationalism, legalism, isolated from other peoples. Palestinian Judaism could never develop out of its bounds, but it's when diaspora Judaism meets a certain form of paganism, Greek thought, that Judaism is changed into the synthesis, Hellenist Judaism. That the term Hellenism is highly problematic is another story, but Bauer is the one to really make this a major tool of analysis in early Christian historiography. Thus, Bauer is keen on the contribution of the Greek philosophical tradition, and through the Bildung und Sitte of Greek culture, Judaism is elevated into something higher. Judaism is then like a miner who gets mature when meeting Greek thought and culture. The same pattern is there when Bauer constructs his narrative of early Christianity. The Jerusalem church is Jewish in the narrow sense. The more legalistic Hebrew apostles stayed in Jerusalem, whereas the Greek-speaking deacons, the so-called Hellenists, had a more spiritual religion and worship and brought the gospel of freedom into the world. This is also true for the diaspora Jew Paul, and due to the freer spiritual condition, it is in the diaspora that Christianity is thriving. If much of Bauer's dialectic has been abandoned, this analysis still sticks with New Testament scholarship. The truth is that Hellenistai, which I think only is used in Acts 6 and 1, I think also in Acts 11, simply means Greek speakers and doesn't imply any special Grecized or freer theology. Rather, I think the Hellenists of Jerusalem were the really Orthodox guys that had come in from the diaspora to be in Jerusalem and worship as closely to the temple as possible. My parallel is the people present, people, diaspora Jews, present at the Western Wall and whose dialect may betray them, that they are not actually from Israel. Stephen's sermon in Acts 7 marks a breakthrough with its bold temple criticism. Christianity, as Bauer sees it, must break away from Judaism and bring about its final destruction, endlicher Untergang. One final example is Bauer's interpretation of Romans, a letter which to him is written to cut Jewish particularism at its roots. I quote, "All the apostle develops in the first 8 chapters is the necessary condition for being able to cut the Jewish particularism that opposed the universalism of the apostle in a Jewish Christian church at its root." End of quote. Bauer's reading of Romans is unrealistic and colored by his strongly ideological glasses. He describes all of his history using this dialectics so that the history of Judaism and Christianity can be described in dichotomies where the Jews or Jewish Christians never get the upper hand. Spirit, gospel, freedom versus law, spiritual and inward versus outward and limited, higher spontaneous ethics versus legalism, faith versus works, universalism versus particularism, elevated versus undeveloped in terms of culture and erudition, and spirituality, but also diaspora versus Palestinian, Pauline versus Petrine, and Hellenistic versus Hebrew. And we can go on with this also to see how he dichotomizes the political situation in Germany using the same opposites. So it becomes kind of a nice list, which I have here. The Jew is then, in a negative sense, the eternal other. And when describing the symbolic world of Bauer, Judaism is on the minus side and Hellenism is on the plus side, thus becoming inherently racist. Jews being narrow particularists, troublemakers who are resisting God's plans and whose religion must go under making them an antithesis of everything which was important for Christianity. It is true that some scholars, for example Schleiermacher, are even more brutal in disconnecting Christianity from Judaism. Bauer's dialectic keeps the thesis as elements in the synthesis. Paul is Jewish, but his Jewishness is dissolved, and through his diaspora existence he is elevated into something higher. Giving this concession to Judaism as playing one part on the way to freedom, still the enlightened polyhistor in Tübingen contributed to a negative picture of Judaism, which is fairly unified in this stream of theology. I also have argued that Bauer is also constructing the history of early Christianity to fit his analysis of the political situation in his country. Here he finds particularism to be the big bad wolf, but envisions a political universalism where the enormous amount of political units in Germany should be dissolved into a liberal national state, just as Rome becomes the political umbrella over the Mediterranean world. And now to Beck. Beck's view of Jews and Judaism is almost the opposite. Whereas Bauer saw Jews and Judaism as representing a superseded stage in the trajectory toward the winning synthesis, Beck had an organic view of the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. In contrast to Bauer's, Beck's spiritual world history pivots around Abraham and Israel, and he describes history as an organic salvation history with the seed in Abraham and the crown in Christ, a grand monarchical world story. The general description of Jews and Judaism is almost entirely positive. The Jewish people are God's covenant people, and Israel is, I quote, the physical carrier of the stem of grace, end quote. The Torah is a positive force, a token of the special relationship between God and the people, and superior to any other legislation. But it is in the connection with the law that it has one of the few negative descriptions of Jews. Before they received the law, they were an obstinate, uncultivated people. But the law disciplined them, which means that Jews under the law are okay in his thinking. The law is then something positive as long as it doesn't lead to legalism. Faith is the foundation for salvation, but instead of an opposition of law and faith, there is a sequence, both in the individual ordo salutis and that of mankind, which are parallel. As noted, to Bauer, particularism and narrow nationalism are negative and typical of Jews. In Beck, however, there is a certain positive particularism, since the family of Abraham is absolutely instrumental in bringing salvation. What is national is positive, and it's God himself that grants the former nomads a nation with the possession of a land. Even Jewish national pride, which is, something which is used so much in the literature, even, in the modern commentaries we were hearing about today. Even Jewish, quote-unquote, national pride is positive. I quote, the pride in being God's people, and it rests primarily on their objective precedence, end quote, he contends. The organic view is illustrated by this growing and developing tree with Abrahamic roots. And in this organic view, continuity instead of discontinuity is natural. History is a harmonic thing, with no radical cuts, no leaving behind of former stages, but rather a unified flow according to God's economy of grace. There is a universalism, but different from Bauer's. The latter abandons all particularisms for a synthetic universalism. Beck's universalism is rooted in and realized through a particular history of a people, a family, a land, and an individual. Christ, who not only is the Messiah of the Jews, but, I quote, the original organic head of the world system, end quote. This is where Bauer sees National Judaism as the main hindrance on Christianity's path to becoming a world historical reality. And here they are absolutely opposite them. Also in his commentary to Romans, Beck is majoring on the Jews, and in fact this argument is developed in critical dialogue with Bauer. And that's a bit fascinating to read that commentary and see how he's actually disputing with his colleague and friend in the same town. In contrast to him, Beck rejects that Romans has any particular criticism of Judaism or Jewish Christianity. Instead, Beck sees a deep continuity between the two. Through the Old Testament, Christians, he says, were spiritually connected to Judaism, and through the Old Testament, he says, Christians were spiritually connected to Judaism, and early Christianity in Rome was so Jewish that people could mistake them for Jews. This is quite a modern view of Judaism and early Christianity in Rome now, as you know. I have chosen this intriguing interaction between two colleagues in beautiful Tübingen to exemplify roughly two positions on Jews and Judaism in 19th century German Protestantism. Some general observations can be made. There is no doubt that the views of Jews and Judaism was conditioned by the actual history of the German Länder during this period. Bauer's dreams of both political universalism, emancipation, national unity of the Greater Germany and democracy are parallel to his analysis of early Christianity, whereas Beck seemingly was more at home in the monarchical system. Bauer associates Jews and Judaism with, to him, negative things as aristocracy, theocracy, and Roman Catholicism. Beck associates Christ with Abraham, Moses, and regards theocracy as something positive. If one constructs their views of Jews and Judaism in a graphic symbolic universe with, in Berger's terms, the sacred canopy at the top and its opposite to the bottom, I know it's simple or perhaps even simplistic, but it's vivid. Beck would place symbols, if we take the sacred canopy as the positive side here, Beck would place symbols as Abraham, Judaism, Israel, law, even circumcision on the sacred canopy. And that's surprising compared with almost every other Christian author. Whereas Bauer would do the opposite. To him, words as freedom from the law, Bildung, and high Platonic ethos would be on the sacred canopy. But Jews, Judaism, law, Palestinian, Jewish Christianity would be at the bottom. Putting this in the context of troubling legacies, Anti-Judaism and Antiquity and Its Aftermath, the two Tübingen professors are each part of opposing paradigms. I know that two black and white descriptions can seem overly simplistic, and I will come to the complexities, but still we can see them really ending up in two different paradigms. Bauer adheres to the typical Enlightenment picture or Enlightenment-oriented research tradition, and Beck to the salvation historical tradition. Jews and Judaism are essential to the salvation historical paradigm, but not necessarily to the Enlightenment-oriented. The theologians of modernity, if they welcomed modernity or fought it, paved the way for later generations in their stand towards Jews and Judaism. The philosemitism of pietist figures like Beck, before him Toluk, and after him Franz Delitzsch and Hermann Strack, made them take a public stand against, for example, the recurring blood libels that became a big problem to the German Jewish public. At the same time as they had profound interest in the missions to Israel, which was no success among German Jewry at all, both Delitzsch and Strack were publicly recognized by German Jewry for their contributions. Nevertheless, Levinson is partly right in pointing to their allosemitism. Solidarity with Jews could be combined with comments like that Jews are obstinate or proud. As we will see in a later Tübingen group, such a negative attitude to Jews and Judaism would bear evil fruit. Enlightenment-oriented views of Jews and Judaism could be programmatically tolerant. We have, for example, the Abwehrverein against antisemitism, which was liberal at its foundation. However, liberal could mean other things than we think. For example, the liberal Professor Rudolf von Gneist could say that, I quote, "When the Jews will give up their distinctiveness, we shall witness the final consummation of emancipation," end quote. This is what we are calling the Janus phase of the Enlightenment. However, political antisemitism grew in pietist circles with the Hofprediger Adolf Stöcker, who combines a full list of anti-Jewish stereotypes with a quote-unquote pious and conservative stance. His tradition is partly imported into another influential phase of Tübingen's theological history, that of Adolf Schlatter, who thought highly of Stöcker. Stöcker had another admirer as well, Adolf Hitler, who admired Stöcker's success in making anti-Semitism a popular movement. During National Socialist times, the picture is complex as well. Both Gerhard Kittel and Walter Grundmann, the most well-known figures in National Socialist exegesis, came from this Tübingen think tank of the late 1920s and early 1930s. Kittel, with roots in philo-Semitic pietism, nevertheless became National Socialist and a programmatic anti-Semite, but halted when it came to rejecting the Hebrew Bible, the text of which his famous father had edited. And when I learned Hebrew once upon a time, it was from Kittel, then Rudolf Kittel's edition. Or he also halted when it was about making Jesus an Aryan, which is impossible to Kittel. He actually had done a pioneer work for the understanding of the Palestinian Jewish roots of early Christianity. Grundmann, on the other hand, bought the message of and indeed became a chief ideologist of the Deutsche Christen, to whom it was imperative to both abandon the Old Testament and to argue that Jesus was an Aryan. To do so, he had to adapt more liberal positions. Deutsche Christen at large was more liberal when it came to the exegesis of the New Testament, something which made it easier to combine their theology with their political ideology. Eventually, Grundmann goes far in his Nazified theology. I quote, and listen to this: "When the Germans stand in the struggle for hereditary soundness and uprightness of life, the Reich has really come among them, and its ruler is the Führer." This is written by the New Testament professor in Jena. One may conclude that ideas like the continuity between Judaism and Christianity, the essentiality of the Hebrew Bible for Christian theology, and the Jewishness of Jesus and early Christianity belong to those things which put a halt to the worst troubling legacies. But even holding to them, a world-leading scholar like Gerhard Kittel could be an anti-Semite. This shows, at the end of the day, it is a choice everyone has to make between love or hate. A firm belief in the absolute dignity of humanity, which is a sine qua non in Jewish Christian tradition, is the only thing that guarantees the protection of every woman, man, and child. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go right into a comment from Joshua Burns, who is an assistant professor of biblical and Jewish studies in the Department of Theology at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Joshua completed his doctoral degree in religious studies and Judaic studies here at Yale in 2010. His research focuses on Jewish life and thought in classical antiquity and early Jewish-Christian relations. His first book, which is based on his doctoral dissertation, will be published by Cambridge University Press in 2015 under the title The Christian Schism in Jewish History and Jewish Memory.
Thank you very much. So this session has seen our conversation migrate summarily from antiquity to modernity. And our neglect, I think, of the time intervening is not unwarranted or not unjustifiable, because little of what Christian intellectuals had to say about Jews and Judaism during the time intervening, let's say the Middle Ages to the time of the Enlightenment, actually improved upon the sordid polemics of the Church's formative age. In contrast, the developments discussed by Drs. Girdmar and Kohler signal the emergence of a new kind of polemic that would, by the end of the 19th century, acquire the notorious name antisemitism. Now, as a scholar of antiquity, I often find myself at odds to see modern anti-Semitism as a modern invention, so much as I see it as a move to breathe new life into an old and familiar prejudice. And so in what follows, I'll briefly respond to Drs. Girdmar and Kohler by explaining what I believe, on the one hand, Ferdinand Christian Bauer, and on the other hand, Bruno Bauer, contributed to this movement in respect to their respective adaptations of the classical Christian supersessionist argument, considering really whether it's fair to characterize what they had to say about that subject as new in view of the intellectual tradition on which they drew. Now, at the heart of both their accounts of Judaism was the distinction between the alleged particularism of the Jew and the contrasting universalism of his non-Jewish counterpart. In respect, or I should say in the writings of F.C. Bauer, the distinction was between Jew and Christian. In the work of Bruno Bauer, the distinction was between the particular Jews and Christian on one hand, and the universal that was his Republican ideal. In any way, in any account, let us take a moment to parse these terms particular and universal that play so heavily in their works. Conventional wisdom would have it that Jesus preached a gospel of universal significance inasmuch as his promise of eschatological salvation applied to all peoples. Or as Jesus himself puts it in the Gospel of Matthew, he wished to make disciples of all nations. And that missionary premise set his sense of God's mercy against a classical Jewish doctrine that promised deliverance only to the nation of Israel, that is, to the Jews, while offering no guarantees regarding the fates of other nations. Jesus' first disciples thereby appreciated what other Jews of their day did not, namely that their Messiah, their Christ, rejected the distinction between Israel and the Gentiles that had been written into their scriptures and thereby upon the Jewish faith. The rest of the Jews, meanwhile, continued to operate on the misguided premise that they would attain salvation by keeping to the outdated rules and regulations laid exclusively upon their ancestors and not the ancestors of other nations at Mount Sinai a very long time ago. So at the heart of the philosophical distinction between Christian universalism and Jewish particularism lies the idea that Jesus rejected Judaism for being too focused on the soteriological needs of the Jews and not focused enough on the needs of humanity at large. But that reading of the gospel is hardly intuitive. Permit me to elaborate. Scholars since F.C. Bauer generally have recognized that the Apostle Paul was the first to discern in the teachings of Jesus his unique concern for the nations, for the Gentiles, thereby distinguishing his own eschatological outlook, and thereby the eschatological outlook, I should say, of Jesus, and thereby of the Christian collective, distinguishing that outlook from that of his fellow Jews. And Paul articulates this theory most clearly, most concisely in his letter to the Galatians. Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, wrote this short missive in response to a report that certain of his constituents in the region of Galatia, in what is today central Turkey, had been visited by other apostles, other messengers of Jesus, who had encouraged them to practice the law of the Jews, that is, to adhere to the legislation of the Torah. To this Paul took offense, inasmuch as he had told them that they, as Gentiles, did not need to practice the Jewish law in order to win God's favor in advance of his impending final judgment. They, said Paul, had only to adhere to the ethical teachings of Jesus in order to partake of God's covenant with Israel. Now, I am, of course, simplifying the circumstances of Paul's correspondence with the Galatian churches quite a bit, and you can drill me on that later, but that will be enough to allow me to make my point. Proceeding to explain why the Gentiles do not have to submit to the legislation of the Torah, Paul alludes to an argument adumbrated elsewhere in his writings whereby he submits that the law of the Jews demands a standard of righteousness impossible for normal human beings to meet. The Torah, in his estimation, was no reward for Israel's faith. It was a sentence for their infidelity, a yoke laid upon the necks of God's chosen people on account of their predilection for sin. God, says Paul, imposed his law, that is, upon the Jews as a preventative measure, or as he puts it, a pedagogue, to keep them in line with his will against their natural instincts. But that precaution, Paul now explains, is no longer necessary. Having given himself as a sacrifice of atonement, Jesus had absolved Israel of sin. The everlasting partnership between God and his people was thus restored to its original state of pure faith, of pistis in Greek. Consequently, Paul asserts, the covenantal privileges once reserved for those bound by the Jewish law were now available to all individuals who elected to practice that faith, that is, the faith of Jesus, to be baptized, or to use Paul's language, immersed in the Messiah. No longer relevant were the distinctions between Jew and Greek, slave and free, or even male and female that stood to divide or separate the worshipers of God. Jesus, he asserts, had joined all of humanity in common cause with one another. Now, to be clear, Paul says nothing here about universalism or particularism. His point is simply that the law of the Jews was meant only for the Jews and only until the advent of the Messiah, whereas the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of that Messiah, were meant for everybody and forevermore. It would take Paul's interpreters to read his words to connote a qualitative contrast between his Christianity and the Judaism that he appeared to indict. Now, of course, Paul would not have recognized himself as a Christian, but as the religious movement that he stimulated grew estranged from its Jewish roots, the rhetorical context of the apostles' account of the Jewish law was lost on readers, apt to see Paul as the Christian par excellence. His critique of the Torah was thereby received as an indictment of the misguided convictions of all who chose to adhere to its legislation. The Jews, in other words, appeared to Paul's readers to spurn the apostles' conviction that Jesus had dissolved the ethnic categories traditionally understood to distinguish them, the Jews, from the Gentiles. And indeed, by the 2nd century, Christian thinkers had begun to style their collective enterprise as a new ethnos, a third race, neither Jewish nor Greek, and united not by the bonds of nationhood, but by the bonds of faith. The apostle to the Gentiles thus inspired Christians to see themselves in terms exclusive of Judaism and its attendant ethnic rhetoric. Christianity, in short, became universal, and Judaism in particular, because Jesus was thought to have made it so. I could say more about the tendentious logic and cultural misperceptions at play here, but I do not wish to get sidetracked. I mean merely to point out that the distinction between the universal and the particular, submitted in various ways by F.C. Bauer and by Bruno Bauer as a rational assumption, was predicated on the fundamentally irrational notion that the birth of Christianity somehow diminished the viability of Judaism as a religion of enduring worth. Now, that's not to say that the premise of bringing the gospel to the Gentiles was devoid of reason. What was irrational was the discourse on Christian identity that arose from that missionary venture, a discourse predicated on the notion that the Jews were bound by their refusal of the gospel to remain forever oppressed by an archaic code of law incompatible with the liberating doctrine espoused by Jesus Christ. Thus, within decades of Christianity's birth, to be a Christian in the minds of many, and I would contend most, who claimed that name of Christian, demanded the construction of the Jew as an intellectual inferior and a social malcontent, somebody who didn't want to get with the program. And in time, that became the dominant Christian truth of Judaism, whereby it would proceed for centuries to inform attitudes toward the Jews amongst those beholden to the Christian intellectual tradition. That tradition, of course, evolved in the modern age into what we now know as the Western tradition, in part by disowning some of its more obviously problematic epistemological foundations. Yet, the impression of Judaism as an obsolete, morally recidivist mode of thought remained fixed in the minds of those Western thinkers apt to see the Jew primarily as a Christian antitype defined by his congenital disregard for those not belonging to his strange and functionally extinct ethnic group. All of which leads me to the following conclusions. For the theologian F.C. Bauer, the stubborn, slavish mentality of the Jew kept him from achieving the humanity of the enlightened Christian. For the political theorist Bruno Bauer, the Jew could achieve that pinnacle of consciousness, but only by disavowing his Judaism. Each on his own succumbed to the fallacy of a cultural stereotype rooted in the ancient theological conceit of supersessionism. In other words, when it came to resenting Jews, these men did not reinvent the wheel. They merely developed more sophisticated ways to describe its mechanism, to express in scientific terms the conventional wisdom of generations past. If, therefore, one is to trace the development of the modern pseudoscience of anti-Semitism to the effort of such scholars and other men of their generation, it bears asking once again what precisely was new about their attitudes toward the Jews and what was old merely made to seem new. I do not imagine that that is a question with as straightforward an answer as I have proposed here, but I hope to have shown that searching our preconceptions about the history and nature of anti-Semitism stands to reveal more unsettling truths about its intellectual underpinnings than even its putative authors knew. Thank you.
Great, we have about 8-9 minutes for questions. So I'm going to open it to the floor, and we're going to use this standing mic over here, and it'd be wonderful if when you ask a question you could identify yourself. Anyone want to take the first step? Please again introduce yourself.
But particularly to you, Professor Gerardmar, I'm wondering about the connection between what I would call the heretical imagination that's occurring in systematic and historical theology in Bauer and the exegetical direction in anti-Semitism. Bauer himself, as I'm sure you know, saw a very close connection between contemporary liberal Protestantism and the heretical movements known then as Gnosticism. I know it's a very contentious term, so much so that his friend and colleague Edward Zahler thought Bauer should just admit, as I think he thought, modern Protestantism was not Christianity in a classical sense. If anything, it was a kind of return to ancient heresies. And so I wonder, particularly in contrast with Beck, part of a much more orthodox pietistic tradition, is there any connection between the revival of a deep attraction to heretical forms of Christianity, arguably endemic to Protestantism, the way it revives Arianism very quickly, Milton and other thinkers, and then becomes the basis of Unitarianism and rationalism, and then is developed very systematically in German biblical studies and systematic theology? Is there a connection between this kind of highly intellectual interpretation of Christianity, the appeal to heresy, and then a very radically intellectually systematized anti-Semitism?
Thank you. I think you can say, I don't know if I can say so much about Beck in this connection. When it comes to Bauer, he definitely has a crash for the Greek, of course, as we say, for the Platonic philosophy and so on, but also for Gnosticism. I mean, he's maybe one of the few Christian authors who really wrote something very, very positive about Gnosticism. So, but then is the question, and I cannot answer that in detail, how informed he is, how deep he has gone into analysis of Gnosticism. I mean, we have to understand that, of course, this is not the Gnosticism we know after the Nag Hammadi findings, because they were really, I mean, they were revolutionizing our whole understanding of Gnosticism. Then it would rather than be the heretical Gnosticism of the apologetes. And of course, he was well aware of all of that debate and well aware of those descriptions. And perhaps he even then was dependent on the picture, the apologetes' picture of Gnosticism, and still took it to himself. So I think this was really constructing of like an alternative universe, so to say, liberal, enlightened, and he has one favorite term that is elevated, erhoben. There is some kind of spirituality which is not bound to the ritual, to the historical, then definitely not to anything Jewish, which he would find then, very particular, bound to certain rituals, certain forms, certain faiths, etc., certain functions, but something which was elevated and we would say, maybe a bit spacey when we study Gnosticism through the apologists. So definitely he has a faiblesse for this. When it comes to Beck, I don't know, but basically Beck would stick to his Bible, because Beck is a biblicist, and he constructs his whole world, thought world, with this big epic reading of the Bible as a unit, with, as I said, a movement from Abraham to Christ as a crown. I don't know if this helps, but...
Thank you very much. My question is for Professor Kohler.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Mike. Nice to meet you. I have a question with respect to the influence and the presences of Spinoza and Mendelssohn in the 19th century. And I know this is a bit complicated, right? Because like Spinoza has a kind of public and a private profile, for example, in 18th century Hamburg. But I'm curious about, with respect to the period that you presented upon, the more public reception and who were the public readers of Spinoza and also Mendelssohn.
For Mendelssohn, it's very easy because he is mostly rejected. I mean, he's recognized as the pioneering figure of modern Jewish thought, but his solution for this very question they all talk about all the time: how could Judaism be justified in modernity? How can we find a reason for the further existence of Judaism after emancipation, after everything particular doesn't play any role anymore? The solution that Mendelssohn found in his famous book Jerusalem is almost entirely rejected by most Jewish thinkers. With Spinoza, it's quite difficult, and there's no one answer, no simple answer, and you even have people changing their minds about Spinoza's contribution to what would be a new Jewish theology, but also in a general philosophy at all. So we have a figure like Hermann Cohen, maybe the most towering Jewish philosopher of the turn of the 20th century, who is really actually changing his mind. In a youthful article from the 1870s, he's praising Spinoza in an even pantheist manner, and then in his later works, Hermann Cohen is rejecting him as the arch-enemy of everything that is Jewish, because he's deterministic, he is not an idealist, and pantheism is seen to be worse than polytheism, actually. So for Spinoza, it's very difficult, but also it's towards the end. It's not exactly the time I was talking about that you have big Spinoza debates. Mendelssohn has this problem because his friend Lessing is accused of being a Spinozist, this all, and there's not much discussion. And then only at the end of the 19th century, Spinoza comes up again as a controversial figure, where Jewish thinkers could not exactly decide which side to take. So with Mendelssohn, it's absolutely clear, and this is on my to-do list, to write an article about Mendelssohn reception in 19th century Jewish Reform theology, because this is very interesting, how they accept him on the one side as the one, the breakthrough figure, the first Jewish thinker who would ever think about this question: what is the exact place of Judaism within universal theology? Not polemically, he is, of course, forced to do that. It's not his own decision, but once forced, he's doing this. But this is the one side, and on the other side, the solution he found, or the answer he gives on this question, is completely rejected by every Reform thinker. And there's a lot of material. There are books, articles in 19th century Jewish theology on Mendelssohn that has no researcher ever touched so far.
So one more question on the right.
I'm Christina Harker. I'm a PhD student in New Testament. This is a question for Josh Burns. I was wondering to what extent you feel that particularly Christian forms of anti-Judaism, ancient ones, things like supersessionism, are informed by the sentiments that we were hearing about in the first session from Greek and Roman authors, whether you think that there's a strong relationship there, and then also whether you would consider the advent of Christianity to also be sort of a new platform for those sentiments to be expressed in the same way as the sort of philosophical innovations of anti-Semitism, I guess.
I have my doubts about the connection between the what we might or might not call the Judeophobic motifs that we heard about earlier, and the rise of theological anti-Semitism. What strikes me, and what has struck a number of scholars who have written about or who have proposed Judeophobia as a distinct type of ethnic bias in antiquity, is that some of the charges, such as those that Professor Isaac mentioned this morning about misanthropy, all sorts of ethnic peculiarities, they escape me at the moment, that they don't really speak to theological concerns, they speak to racial or ethnic concerns. I think that to posit a link between the sort of racial bias that arose really beginning in the 17th century following the introduction of Hebraic and Judaic scholarship to the Protestant Academy, that sort of what I called before pseudoscientific anti-Semitism couched in terms of racial theory and cultural theory. I don't really see a connection, a clear connection between that kind of talk and the works of Tacitus and Juvenal and so forth, although certainly the professors who first devised this, incidentally I should say, were theologians. One assumes that they were familiar with some classical sources, although they certainly didn't rely on those sources in their production of ethnographic studies of the Jews of contemporary Europe.
Let's have a hand for the panelists and for the wonderful